Hi, everyone. I'm Mr. Irvin, and today I will be talking about the major reasons for the United States' involvement in World War I. So, in the summer of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain reaction that embroiled Europe in what would become known as the Great War, or World War I. World War I divided Europe into two sides: the Central Powers, which consisted of Germany, Austria Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and the Allied powers, which was primarily France, Britain, and Russia, but would later actually be expanded to include Japan and Italy as well. In the years leading up to World War I, America had sought to build an imperial empire, expanding its influence in the Western Hemisphere and across the Pacific Ocean. However, America had, for the most part, stayed out of events in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. So therefore, when World War I broke out in 1914, the United States declared its neutrality, hoping that the Atlantic Ocean would buffer the country from the fighting in Europe. And of course, this made sense. The president at the time was Woodrow Wilson, who was the least imperialist of the progressive presidents. His moral diplomacy had driven him to push back on some of the most imperialistic tendencies of his predecessors. For example, he passed the Jones Act, which had promised to give the Philippines its independence, and he even appointed William Jennings Bryan, a staunch anti-imperialist, as his Secretary of State. Now, America had not completely abandoned their expanding role in the world under Wilson, for the president found himself intervening in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico during his time in office. However, while his moral diplomacy had a blind spot for Latin America, as we've looked at in the past, for the most part, the country found itself in a much more isolationist position in 1914 than it did in, say, previous administrations under the rule of Teddy Roosevelt or William Taft. So Wilson hoped to keep it that way. And for the first few years of the war, America was able to stay out of the fighting that was taking the lives of millions of Europeans. In general, most Americans agreed with this policy. And in the election of 1916, Wilson was able to narrowly retake the White House, campaigning on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet, within a few months of being reelected, Wilson found himself standing before Congress and asking for a declaration of war. So, how did this rapid about-face happen? Let's dive in and figure that out. So the first and perhaps most important cause of America's entry into World War I was unrestricted submarine warfare. When World War I broke out, both the Central Powers and the Allies sought to control the Atlantic Ocean. Great Britain, with its powerful navy, proved to be well equipped for this task, and they established an effective blockade of Germany by cutting off access to the North Sea. Germany responded to the British blockade by establishing a submarine war zone around the British Isles. Submarines, called U-boats in Germany, were a relatively new invention that had not really been tested in war. Existing rules of warfare stated that battleships had to stop and board a merchant vessel. However, these rules did not apply to submarines because surfacing would make them vulnerable to attack. Therefore, submarines began to sink ships entering and leaving the established submarine war zone. And while the German government stated that it would try not to target neutral ships, it also acknowledged that mistakes were bound to be made. Now, the use of submarines immediately created problems for American neutrality. At the beginning of 1915, Germany had a great deal of success targeting ships in and around Great Britain. Within the first few months of the year, over 90 ships had been sunk by U-boats. The problem was that U-boats could not always tell who they were sinking, and inevitably, Americans got caught up in the crossfire. The best example of this was the sinking of the Lusitania on May 7th, 1915. Now, the Lusitania was a British passenger liner that set sail from New York to Liverpool, England. The ship was struck by a torpedo off the coast of Ireland, and it sank in about 18 minutes, killing 1,198 people, 128 of whom were Americans. Now, it is really important to note that the sinking of the Lusitania was not the cause of America's entry into World War I, which should be evident by the fact that it occurred 2 years before the United States actually decided to get involved. However, it did have several important effects on the United States and its policies. First, despite the fact that the Lusitania was targeted because it was carrying ammunition bound for the Allies, its destruction inevitably did turn American public opinion against Germany. and there were growing cries within the United States to retaliate. War hawks like Teddy Roosevelt began to urge the government to make preparations for war, and by the end of the year, Wilson's administration had established a policy of preparedness, which sought to expand the American Army and Navy. Now, however, at the same time that we were kind of preparing for the possibility of war, Wilson was making diplomatic attempts to defuse the situation. It would continue to insist that unarmed and neutral vessels not be sunk by German U-boats. So when a French ship, the Sussex, was torpedoed in March of 1916, resulting in 80 casualties, including 2 Americans, Wilson threatened to cut off diplomatic ties with Germany. This ultimatum was generally understood to be a prelude to war. So, not wanting Americans to join the war effort, Germany agreed to the Sussex Pledge, which stated that they would no longer attack passenger and merchant ships without warning. The Sussex Pledge eased tensions and allowed Americans to remain neutral for the rest of 1916. And Wilson was able to then claim in the upcoming election in 1916 that he did indeed keep us out of war. The next year, however, brought new challenges for America's fragile neutrality. In January of 1917, Germany announced that they would abandon the Sussex Pledge and wage war, unrestricted submarine warfare, that is, within the submarine war zone around Great Britain. Germany would use U-boats to target all boats in the war zone, including American ships. It was now almost impossible for the United States to remain neutral. And even Germany was well aware that a policy of complete unrestricted submarine warfare could force the United States into World War I. Now, it's important to note that Germany didn't want America to enter into the war, but it was becoming desperate. 3 years of fighting in trenches on the Western Front had taken a terrible toll on Germany as well as their allies. They were now gambling that an all-out assault on Great Britain's supply lines could turn the tide in their favor. They were hoping to choke off trade to Great Britain and, in essence, starve the British into submission before America could get involved in the war. Now, to make matters worse, the Zimmerman Note was intercepted and published in March of 1917. The Zimmerman Note was a secret communication intercepted by British intelligence from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmerman to the Mexican government. Now, the note proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico in the event that the United States entered World War I. In the proposal, Mexico would join the side of the Central Powers, and in return, Germany would help Mexico regain land it had lost in the previous century, including Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Publication of the Zimmerman Note outraged many Americans and led to further calls for war. The existence of the Zimmerman Note also supports the idea that unrestricted submarine warfare was a main cause of the United States' entry into World War I. Germany knew that their aggressive policies would cause outrage within the United States, and their attempts to gain an ally in Mexico shows that they were preparing for the very real possibility that America would join the Allied powers. Shortly after the Zimmerman Note was published, 4 American ships were sunk by German U-boats. In less than a month, Wilson would ask Congress for a declaration of war. Now, a second major reason for American involvement in World War I was the economic ties between the United States and the Allied powers. When the war broke out, American neutrality allowed it to sell goods to both sides. The United States had been in a recession just before World War I, and the start of the war proved to be financially beneficial to both American farmers and businesses. In 1914, the United States sold millions of dollars of goods to Britain, France, and Germany. However, as the war went on, the British blockade of the North Sea made it more and more difficult for American ships to reach German ports. Despite the protest of American farmers, businesses, and shippers, the British Navy was able to cut off trade with the Central Powers almost entirely. So essentially, by 1915, the United States' trade disproportionately favored the Allied powers. For example, in 1914, the United States exported $600 million worth of goods to Great Britain and almost $350 million worth of goods to Germany. By 1916, American exports to Great Britain totaled over $1.5 billion. Meanwhile, German exports had almost completely dried up, totaling less than $300,000. In addition, J.P. Morgan and Company, one of the United States' largest banking firms, advanced the Allies over $2.3 billion while America was still considered neutral. These economic connections made it easier for the United States to join on the side of the Allies. Now, a great deal would be made of the economic ties between the United States and the Allies in the aftermath of the war. Some revisionist historians and government groups, such as the Nye Committee, would argue in the decades that followed that America was pulled into World War I by greedy munitions manufacturers. These claims would be used after World War I to justify a growing isolationist sentiment that was spreading through America. However, in reality, most American businesses were profiting before America entered into the war and preferred to remain neutral. America's economic interests made it easier to join the side of the Allies, yes, but that does not tell the entire story. In reality, the unrestricted submarine warfare that was taking the lives of civilians was America's primary cause for entering World War I. We can't discount the next reason either, which greatly persuaded the public. So the last reason that the United States joined World War I was to spread democratic ideals. Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy was shaped by a commitment to moral diplomacy. Wilson believed that the United States should actively promote democracy abroad, and as World War I dragged on, he saw an opportunity for America to play a role in reshaping the world in America's image, or at least so he thought. In 1914, at the start of the war, it was hard to claim that World War I was fought over democratic principles. One of the Allied powers was Russia, which was ruled by a czar. Russia was one of the largest authoritarian governments in the world, and many Russian immigrants, especially those of Jewish descent, did not want America to support the Tsar. However, in March of 1917, the same month that the Zimmerman Note was being released, a revolution occurred in Russia that swept the Tsar from power and established a new constitutional government. Thus, when Wilson addressed Congress on April 2nd, 1917, and asked for a declaration of war, he was able to declare that America was going to war in order to make the world safe for democracy. A second communist revolution led by Vladimir Lenin would eventually take control of Russia and cause it to withdraw from the war entirely. However, that did not change the argument that America was getting involved in the war to champion democracy. The war was now framed as a war of democracy versus autocracy, and Wilson used the cause of democracy to persuade Americans to support World War I, which went against the United States' long history of isolationism when it came to European conflict. So the importance of Wilson's idealism would be further reflected in his 14 points, which was a proposal to ensure peace after World War I, calling for an end to secret alliances, widespread arms reduction, national self-determination, and a new League of Nations. The 14 points would be a huge step in the promotion of democracy abroad for the United States.